Welcome to Unboxing History. I'm Christine Hopkins, co-host of the Unboxing History podcast.
And I'm Jodi Wright-Gidley, director of the Galveston County Museum.
Every month on Unboxing History, presented by the Galveston County Museum, we unboxed a new artifact that's part of the museum's collection. So Jodi, what do we have this month?
So this month we are unboxing something that is kind of related to a season we have here that makes people get a little worried, hurricane season. And so we are unboxing a special portrait of someone that's related. This is Dr. John Freeman. So Dr. John Freeman was a pioneering meteorologist. He got his start being a meteorologist, and then he joined the Army Air Corps, where he developed his meteorology and his experience further. It was very important for the military to have accurate weather forecasts because pilots needed it to plan their flights and missions. And so as he was working in that field, he was a real pioneer developing new weather forecasting technologies. Dr. Freeman has worked at the U.S. Weather Bureau. He developed the Weather Research Center along with co-founded that with his daughter, Jill Hassling.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had their Weather Research Center in Houston, and they had a museum. And the museum there was really one of a kind. It was a place all about weather. Children and the public could go and learn about tornadoes and hurricanes and climate change and weather forecasting. And that museum was a great museum it started in 2006, but it unfortunately closed in 2011. And then they worked with other museums in the area to then take in that collection and carry on that tradition. And so our museum actually obtained some of his collection. And so here at our museum, we have recreated Dr. Freeman's weather forecasting office from the 1940s.
Oh, wow.
It has a lot of different equipment. And so those things are now part of our collection.
So what kinds of weather instruments are part of this exhibit and part of his office replica?
Well, there's a lot of things that really isn't used anymore because technology has changed. But we have a machine called the WEFAX. We have barometers, slide rules, different instruments that did the job of weather forecasting back then.
Well, I think it would be nice to speak to an expert on weather. Do you think we know of anyone who might be able to help us with that?
I think we do.
And so this month on this month's Unboxing History podcast, we're really excited to have a guest, Dr. Hal Needham, also known as Hurricane Hal. So he's going to be telling us a little bit more about this exhibit and the instruments that we look at and we may not understand a thing about. So we're going to talk to him a little bit more. So Jodi, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Welcome, Hal. I'm so glad you're here at the Galveston County Museum. And we are going to rely on your expertise to really finish telling the story that we've started. Dr. Freeman is someone we introduced a few minutes ago. How do you feel like his legacy is sort of similar to your own?
Oh, I mean, it's amazing just the work he did. And he had this passion for outreach and education, I would say. I noticed that he helped start meteorology programs at Texas A&M and University of St. Thomas. One of my passions early on was working with the universities. Over a 12-year period, I worked at universities in Pennsylvania, Alaska, Louisiana, and Colorado. So I get that vibe. There's a lot of energy at the university system. Students come in, they're so curious. So that's part of it. But also, I love the fact that he really did what I call applied meteorology. He was making forecasts that pilots could use. And for me, I always want to make forecasts that people can use to make decisions, as opposed to theoretical meteorology that you're behind the scenes working with, like developing math equations or something like that.
That makes sense. We need to know. We need to be prepared and all of that. So the exhibit that we have here at the museum includes a lot of different weather tools. Can you tell us more about them?
Yeah, they have so many interesting instruments. So things that we'd be familiar with, like thermometers that measure temperature, barometers that measure air pressure, all these different types of things. Even they had instruments that measured humidity and what they call the mixing ratio, which tells you more about the water content in the air. It's really interesting looking at the barometers that they had back in the day. The history of the barometer is fascinating. So barometers measure air pressure, and that's really important for weather. When we have high pressure, that's when we have clear skies and light winds. When we have low pressure, we get a lot of storms. And so the barometer was really invented in the 1600s. They had mercury barometers that were a tube that was open on one end. And when the high pressure was pushing down more, the mercury actually dropped. But by the time that Freeman and his group was really doing work in the 40s, they were using more what we call aneroid barometers. Those were using springs and discs that the air pressure would push on them with a meter, kind of like the ones that we might see in our parents' or grandparents' home where we have the meter on the wall. That's really what they were using in the 1940s, and that's what we have here more in display at this exhibit. Today, we use more digital instruments, whether it's thermometers or barometers, where we're just seeing a digital reading. Back then, they used a lot of instruments with needles and dials that the meteorologist would actually have to go up to the instrument, look at it, and then write it down on paper on a log.
And now we have computers to do a lot of that for us.
Yeah, now things are very computerized. I think that big shift shifted over in the 80s and 90s. But even you go back 50 years ago, a lot of things were very manually done. So we would have instruments where the meteorologist had to look at them and write them down. And also a big difference is weather maps. Today, all of that's computer generated and sent by computers. Back in the day, Freeman and his colleagues would have actually hand-drawn weather maps, which is a very meticulous, they spent a lot of time to develop these.
So one of the things we have at the museum is a WeFax machine. What is that about?
This is really fascinating. So today we just take pictures on a smartphone and can send it across the world instantaneously. Back in the day, the question was really, how in the world can you transmit images over remote distances? And so WeFax is really a form of radio fax. This is basically sending a facsimile but over radio waves. This technology came out in the 1920s. So there's evidence of the first long distance WeFax was an image of President Calvin Coolidge that was sent from New York City to London in November of 1924. But even by the 30s and 40s, we started seeing these being used for like news reporting. For example, the iconic image of the soldiers in World War II hoisting the American flag at Iwo Jima, that printed the next day in American newspapers. How in the world did they get that picture from the Pacific? It was actually sent by WeFax or radio fax from Guam to New York City.
So what is the part of
So the we part of it, when we think of radio fax, the we part is specifically for weather. So when we think of WeFax, it's like a weather fax. And so they were using the same technology to send images over radio waves, but they were doing it with weather maps. A lot of times meteorologists like Freeman were hand drawing these weather maps, and then they could actually put them in a WeFax machine and send them out to broad audiences using radio waves.
Here at the museum, we've recreated Dr. Freeman's office from the 40s. So is there anything in this exhibit that you do still use today?
Yeah, a lot of the instruments were measuring data or measuring weather information that we still measure today, temperature and humidity, air pressure, wind speed, but they were doing it very differently for the most part. Now it's very digital, I would say, except for anemometers, which measure wind speed. We still use cup anemometers, and some of those are still very similar. But a lot of these things we see back in the day, they had dials and needles, and now it's more digital. But we're still measuring the same thing. It's still very important that we can measure temperature, humidity, the wind speed, these types of things from the ground, just like they did back in the 1940s.
For those of you who don't know, Hurricane Hal is also very knowledgeable about the 1900 storm, and he does tours about historic storms all around Galveston. So let's talk a little bit more about the 1900 storm. I'm really curious about how the meteorologists at that time, the climes, and what did they use, and how did they, try to predict the weather that time?
Yeah, so it was a very different time back then. They did not have the benefit of what we call remote sensing. Now we have radar and we have satellites and all these ways to detect when a storm is out there. They didn't have that back in 1900. They had really land-based weather instruments. They could send information from one station to another through telegraph, but they didn't have a lot of what we had today. Unfortunately, the 1900 storm approached the upper Texas coast in September of 1900 as a very powerful Category 4 hurricane. They really had no indication that this was coming until, I would say, the day before, when really large swells or these big waves that outran the storm started arriving on the coast. But in general, they had these similar weather instruments with temperature and humidity and air pressure and wind speed, but they didn't have a way to really remotely sense that something was coming in from the Gulf. So that's why really Galveston was taken by surprise on September 8th, 1900. Unfortunately, 6,000 to 8,000 deaths on the island. It seems like when we include the mainland, maybe as many as 10,000 to 12,000 deaths from the 1900 storm. It's still the deadliest disaster in U.S. history.
Yeah. We have an exhibit about that too. So be sure when you visit the Galveston County Museum that you stop and visit both the Dr. Freeman section as well as the 1900 storm exhibit.
If I can say one more thing too about at the time of where the Kleins were here, Isaac Klein and his brother Joseph, they were here with the U.S. Weather Bureau. Galveston actually has the longest continuous weather records west of the Mississippi River. So we have the Weather Bureau here since 1871 providing continuous weather information. So Galveston has a long history of weather observations, and the U.S. Weather Bureau, which is now the National Weather Service. What's interesting also about that time is they were just kind of emerging into the better science of meteorology. So they understood that some of these things they recorded, we still record today. They knew that these basic parameters were important, but there were still some theories and some myths out there. One of them is if a hurricane's coming to the coast, there was a myth that you're going to see a red brick sky. So you're going to look out from a high building and the sky is going to look like red bricks out there. And so they kept looking for that when the wind picked up and the water picked up, thinking, if it's a hurricane, we're surely going to see a red brick sky. They never saw it. And I think the 1900 storm and the work here proved that that was just a myth. That wasn't really true. Is there anything they could have been done better? On the day of the storm, I think they did everything they absolutely could have. They were very attentive. They were working as hard as they could. It was more in the bigger picture of that era. It's very, we can get into this thing of them downplaying it.
So from your perspective, what's the biggest lesson that people today can learn from the 1900 storm and the work that the Klein brothers did then?
I think the biggest lesson is looking at your risk in a big picture and also looking at what's happening in your neighborhood. So for example, if you live in a neighborhood where 2 or 3 of your neighbors have been robbed, you can say, well, I haven't been robbed. It'll never happen to me. Or you could say, I live in kind of a dangerous neighborhood. I might need to take precaution, right? So, and that's the case of the Upper Texas coast in the 1800s. There was a city down the coast called Indianola, which was not as big as Galveston, but it was vibrant. It was growing about 120 miles south of Galveston. It was hit by hurricanes in 1875 and 1886 and wiped off the face of the map. It's a ghost town. It was destroyed and it completely abandoned after the 1886 hurricane. A powerful storm surge, this wall of salt water washed over Indianola in both cases, and they just ended up abandoning the site. What's interesting to me is that Galveston also got a lot of flooding in 1875 and 1886 from those hurricanes, and a city just down the coast was wiped off the face of the map. So it's interesting to me that really Galveston's risk was largely downplayed, and even Isaac Klein himself had testified that he did not believe a hurricane could destroy Galveston. That's confusing to me in a sense because Galveston was severely flooded, especially in 1886. There was talk about building a seawall, and it's strange to me that a neighboring city was wiped off, the earth, and yet the Galvestonians maintained that they didn't have the risk. I think in a sense there was a lot of pressure on them. There was a lot of investment and huge growth here. Galveston was extremely wealthy. And I think the concept that Galveston wasn't vulnerable to hurricanes would have been very much applauded by the local commercial interests that wanted people to continue investing in Galveston.
Yeah. So what do you think people should take away when they see our John Freeman exhibit and our 1900 storm and they take your tour? What is the thing you want people to take away from all of that?
I think 2 things. Number one, the amount of painstaking effort that John Freeman and his colleagues put into meteorological science back in the day. We take that for granted now. We have a lot of technological luxuries today. In our modern era, they put a lot of work into doing what's a lot easier for us today. And I think there's an appreciation of the science when you look back. I've been leading Galveston Hurricane Tour for 7 years, and it's really the stories of how Galveston's endured hurricanes over all these years, a lot of human interest stories. We get into the science of hurricanes, and it really parallels a lot of what y'all have done here in the museum. I love your displays. You're amazing at storytelling here and really taking people back to that time. And that's really what we're trying to do too with Galveston Hurricane Tour, by taking people out in the city and getting back to that time and really understanding how Galveston became so resilient.
Right. So one of the lesser known storms that struck Galveston was in 1915. What stands out about that hurricane?
I think that's one of the most misunderstood hurricanes that ever struck Galveston. In a sense, it was a very powerful hurricane, a large, slow-moving hurricane that made landfall about 50 miles south of Galveston. But because it was so large and moving so slow, we had hurricane-force winds in the city for about 10 hours. It did a lot of destruction. People talk about the night of terror. The worst of it was at night, and it was a long, hard night for Galvestonians. But in general, when we look back at the history, the intensity and the scope of the storm is usually overestimated and the impacts underestimated. And again, Galveston was trying to show the world that we're protected by the seawall and we're not going to be destroyed by another hurricane. But I think some of the impacts, when you look back at the history, were very minimized by the Galvestonians trying to show that we don't have a hurricane problem anymore. But when you look at some of the photos of the waves crashing over the seawall and destroying whole blocks there in that area near the seawall, and actually there were also numerous deaths behind the seawall as well. Some of that and some of the historical accounts are downplayed, I think, in the effort to show that Galveston was not vulnerable to hurricanes anymore. So this was a big, bad hurricane, catastrophic by today's standards. And I think it really showed us that even though we have the seawall, even though we raised the grade of the island, we're still very vulnerable to hurricanes here.
Yeah, though when I see the 1915 hurricane photos, those always stand out as looking a little odd because it was after the grade raising. And so a lot of the buildings had shifted and you have these piles of sand everywhere. And it just looks really different from any other photo collection.
Some of those photos, when you first look at the damage, you think that has to be 1900 storm. And when you realize, wait, this is 1915, the seawall has been built, the grade has been raised, it makes you think about today, if we were to get a direct hit from a very powerful hurricane, the damage might be a lot higher than people expect.
Yeah. So we live in a hurricane-prone area. And so what is your general advice for everyone to think about?
Yeah, one of the things is really realizing, I say we live in a place with high risk, high reward, right? We have the deadliest disaster in U.S. history here. The deadliest industrial disaster in U.S. history was 10 miles away. But yet most of the year we go out and it's sunny and beautiful and we have this amazing beach. So it's an amazing place to be, but we have to realize we are at high risk. We have to take seriously hurricane wind and flooding. And I think my main advice for people would be to get out ahead of these things, whether it's preparing your property, how you build your house, but also if a storm is approaching, the best thing you can do is leave early, not only to protect yourself, but you also don't want to get stuck in that evacuation gridlock. That those have actually been fatal themselves. Like we think back to Hurricane Rita in 2005, where it was taking people 8-9 hours to get to Houston. You don't want to get stuck in that. So I always encourage people, be prepared early. And if you leave a couple days before a storm arrives and it was an unnecessary evacuation, at least you left on open roads. You weren't running out of gas and you didn't have these other problems that come with gridlock evacuation.
So Dr. Needham, will you just walk us through the Dr. Freeman exhibit one more time and talk about the instruments?
I'd love to. Y'all have so many great artifacts and instruments here. I'd love to walk through that with y'all.
If you'll just walk us through more of the instruments that are in our exhibit.
Sure. This is called a clinometer. It looks like a stopwatch, and actually it is. So in the 1930s, they started using weather balloons because if you think about weather, we're very interested in what's happening on the ground, but also interested in what's happening higher in the atmosphere. With this, they could actually launch a balloon and start the stopwatch, and the hand would turn, and it would actually, because balloons generally would ascend at a constant rate, they would actually time how long it took a weather balloon to hit the clouds, and they would stop this. And this would use time to estimate how high the clouds are. Again, they would start the clock, it would start spinning, they would let go of a balloon. And when the balloons hit the cloud, they would stop it. It would tell at what elevation those clouds are at. And so today we would use a laser. We would just point a laser at that. So again, a lot of things are digital. Back in the day, it was needles and things like that, dials and needles, and they'd actually have to manually interpret this.
So I think this is called a slide rule, but I have no idea what it does.
A slide rule, it's interesting, used in meteorology, but also used just in science in general. It's kind of like an early calculator where you could slide this along. You have these different basically scales that line up. So even in mathematics classes, my dad would talk about using slide rules in the 50s and even 60s. It was just a way to do very quick mathematical calculations. You didn't have to be a meteorologist. You might just be working in construction or engineering or another part of sciences. If I show these two together, this is a mixing ratio calculator and this is a temperature evaluator, but these just show a lot of their instruments back in the day had a lot of these dials that you turned. Like with the mixing ratio calculator, you're trying to take a parcel of air and understand what mass of that was just dry air and what mass was basically the moisture of the air. And so you would set these dials up and turn them to make these calculations. Again, all of this would be digital today. And the same with this temperature evaluator. This related to radiosones and related to weather balloons going up. But again, they had dials and they would turn and spin these types of things to make calculations. You can see that these turn. Again, they would at that point, they would launch weather balloons, but then the information they were getting back, they would use these types of dials to understand like the humidity levels or different properties of the atmosphere. Today, all of this would be computerized and digital. This here is a ship weather messenger. And again, a lot of dials, there's a lot of little information around the sides. This gets into the concept of coded weather. So weather has been sent through codes for a long time, really getting back to the days of the early telegraph, all the way through the 40s and 50s. And even when I started getting into weather in the 1980s, I had a shortwave radio, and you could actually hear coded messages. It just sounded like very fast Morse code, like really fast. I had a decoder that would actually, I could see that there were consistent coding messages. I went to my local National Weather Service office and they gave me a key to break the code to see what they're talking about. It seemed like I was being a spy in my basement when I was 12 years old. But again, this gets into some of these things where they have codes and different things that a meteorologist was observing in the atmosphere. They would have different coded numbers that they would
But
put
why
in.
were they coding it?
So great question. Why coding it, right? A lot of times it was to transmit as much information as you could as quickly.
Oh, okay.
So for example, they would, you would have your air pressure, your temperature, your wind direction. So instead of typing out that the winds are coming from the east, that would take a lot of letters in a Morse code or a teletype.
Mm-hmm.
They would just have, so far over in your coded message, you have a number. If it said 090, that's a compass direction for an east wind, for example. So it was a way to really make the information more compact to go out in a numeric code. And then someone on the other end could use a decoder to kind of understand what your coded message meant.
So before now, you hadn't been to the museum, and now you have. And so as you looked around, what stood out? What did you enjoy here?
Oh, I loved it. You have such a depth here of different artifacts and stories. I thought it did a great job with the storytelling. What really hit me was walking through and seeing the artifacts that were found on bodies from the 1900 storm, the coroner's ledger, all of that. And the reason I thought that was important, it's really humanizing the impact of that storm. And that's one of the big challenges with forecasting and communicating meteorology. We can talk about miles per hour wind or the height of floodwaters, but the challenge is really to humanize it. What does this mean as potential impacts on the ground? When we look back and we're seeing these different angles of telling these stories and the impact on the population, I think it really helps touch people and help them understand the context and the severity of these types of storms. And that really helps bring this history when we look back into understanding our risk and prevention as we move forward today, as we look into the future.
Yeah. It's important to learn from history. Thank you so much for being here. We've enjoyed it. I've learned a lot because when our museum got this collection, it was a really kind of a mystery to me. I'm not a weather expert, and now I know a lot more, and we're going to do some changes in the exhibit based on what we've learned today.
Something that really hit me from walking around too was that all these different instruments they use to measure the weather, but a lot of them are based on communicating the weather, from the encoded instrument thing to the WEFAX. The challenges they had to communicate over long distances were so much harder than we have today, and I think we can all learn that from coming here to the exhibit.
Thank you, Jodi. What did you learn today from Hurricane Hal or Dr. Needham that you didn't know before?
Well, the instrumentation information I had not known before, and so I learned a lot about that. It's amazing how technology has changed, but it's also still a little bit the same. You're still measuring the same things. You're just using a computer today instead.
Well, and an important part of this museum is people taking away something, learning something. What do you want people to learn about the Freeman exhibit?
Well, I just want them to appreciate, technology changes so much and so fast. And it was people's hard work that did that. So that's what I appreciate. And I hope that people learn is all the people that came before us that did the hard work that we get to benefit from. And we also need to just remember where we came from and learn from history, because even when you're talking about hurricane history, and we still live in a hurricane-prone place, you've got to learn those lessons so that you can be more prepared.
What's on exhibit at the museum is just a small portion of the overall collection here at the museum. How much percentage-wise of the collection is actually available for people to see, and what's behind the scenes that may be a good resource tool for them?
Well, so about 30% of our collection is on exhibit here for everyone to see, and the rest is in storage upstairs. But that, just because it's sitting in storage doesn't mean that no one can ever see it. We do bring things out different from time to time, and we're also here for researchers. So if you're doing a project and you are really needing to do some digging, contact us, because we might have something that will help you, and we will be glad to help.
If you're interested in visiting the museum, the Galveston County Museum is open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 10 to 4. But also, you can have your own museum experience called Padlock Mystery. For those of you that don't know, Jodi, will you tell us a little bit about this Padlock Mystery?
Sure. So we have someone scheduled later on this week to play the game. You get the museum to yourself, you and whoever it is that you invite. And we set 4 locked boxes around the museum. You find clues throughout the museum to help you open these boxes that lead you to the next clue. And in the end, you end up making something that's really cool to play with.
Every time I come to the museum, and of course I've been coming once a month, if not more, I always see something new, something I didn't know before. I learned something new, and it's just a real hidden gem on the island. We're located in the old former courthouse And what's the address again?
So we're in the old courthouse that's at 722 Moody, which is also 21st Street. We're inside, first floor lobby.
Thank you for tuning in to Unboxing History presented by the Galveston County Museum. Please follow this podcast and tag your history-loving friends. You'll find this podcast on I-45 Now's Pod Now and everywhere where you watch and listen to your podcast. And make sure you check out our channel on YouTube as well.